So about 3 or 4 days later, I didn't tell anybody. So Mr. Goad calls me from Pontiac. He said, "Where'd you get that engine?" I says, "I made it." "What do you mean you made it?" I says, "No, I made it." I said, "My repairman and I, we put it together." He says, "Well, I want you to come down here." I says, "Well, why?" I says, "I just dropped it off. You guys can do what you want." "No, I want you to come down. Let's go back to the white car." So what they done, he found out right away. Mr. Weitzel that owned Pass at the time, I worked with him too, knew him, and he already figured out what it was. He saw it there. He realized right away. So in 3 days, they'd had the other engine out of the car. They put the one I built for it in, and it was setting in the car, wired up, hosed up, but they didn't have any exhaust manifolds. He says, we need some exhaust manifolds for this thing. And I says, "Well, I can't help you. I mean, you guys got very talented fabricators and machinists and people here to do that." He said, "No, we want you to help." I said, "Look, I can't come down here and do that." So I went back to work and got a call from Mr. Galbraith a day or so later. He says, "Well, Pontiac seems to think that you can help them and go down there and do something on this car." He says, "No, you got 3 days and that's it." He says, "You'll be back here." And he says, "You better not be spending any of our money." I said, "Okay." So I went down, and what they did, they gave me this, I forget the guy's name, but he was an extremely talented fabricator. And they also says, "When you get done, we got a draftsman, we're going to draw this up." Mike Dan Van Auken, okay. And these guys were very, very talented folks. And we started working on it, and I realized right away, if we were to make this into a production program, we can't. I just like to make a set of headers, something to flow nice and come up and run the turbo. No, we got to do this more like production. And I worked on the Buick Grand National Regals exhaust manifolds, and they had a lot of cracking originally before they ever produced them. And I got to work on it, and I thought, if we ever do that, and we have a crack with this one, and we won't get another chance. So we went over to the place, I think it was R&B Manufacturing, and I took the fabricator with me, and we looked at the fixtures that they were making the manifolds on, and we took some measurements, and they gave us some flanges and some parts, and what we tried to do was make it so it would run over those fixtures and not change very much, because we knew we didn't have a program, a formal thing with General Motors backing it. So that's what we made, and then the manifolds that you have on your cars today were made that way. And I made a 3-into-1, but instead of having a real nice collector, I had to make it so it was more production collector, and then we tucked it in around the bottom of the transmission. And on the passenger side, that was the one we had cracking, and I almost made a nice 3-into-1 to that, but I thought I knew about the cracking, so we just tucked it in a little bit and tried to make everything a little more robust, a little stronger, a little thicker, and we made one for them, and then we got the draftsman come over and started drawing it. We made 3 or 4 more because they had a sister car to this one, the automatic car. And then we had a couple more. Mr. Gold wanted one for the draftsman and one for a dyno that I think Mr. Kelly worked on. And so that's what we did. And then I went back to and did my own job at up in the engine plant for a while. We didn't hear very much about it. And what happened was that Mr. Gold then took these cars and he showed it to Pontiac upper management. And a fellow named Byron Warner was the chief engineer of Pontiac, and he backed Mr. Goad. Mr. Goad actually was the guy pushing this whole thing. But Byron Warner, the chief engineer, and Mike Losh was the general manager of the division of Pontiac. He kind of backed it. They didn't, at that time, they were under what they called the new organization called CPC. It was called Chevrolet Canada Pontiac, and Buick was under BOC, Buick Olds Cadillac. And Pontiac was supposed to use all Chevrolet engines. That's how it was stacked up. Well, Mr. Losh understood that a lot of the things that came to make Pontiac great was they had their own engines. And he could see what this was already coming to. They drove it and they knew. So he kind of tacitly supported it under the table. And they went over and drove it, and they thought, we understand what we have here, but now we got to somehow make this happen. So let's go to the gray car. So Mr. Gold called me up and says, "Why don't you come down?" I said, "Okay, I'll come down in the evening." I come down there, and I walked out in the back of the shop, and here's this gorgeous gray, silver gray, brand new Trans Am. It had 5 miles on it. It had the gold wheels, the gold emblems. It was beautiful. He says, "I want you to build another one of those engines for us. We're going to put it in here. We don't want all the wires and hoses and thermocouples and all that stuff running around. We want to make it just like a production car. And I never worked on one like that before. Everything I'd worked on were prototypes, and there were always cut holes in the dash, and we had wires running all over it, thermocouples, and you know, I thought, I can't do that. You know, he said, no, we want you to do it, and you do a good job for us. And okay, so we had Billy Briggs, we had Jeff Bites, the owner of the place, we had Rich Anderson, we had Mr. Kelly, we had Mr. Van Auken, all these guys helping. We made it as close as we could get to production. When you open the hood, you swear it was all the regular connections were there, real hoses. We didn't have braided steel and fittings running all over. And we built that car, and then it was a little later when we got it finished, and he wanted me to come down and drive it. So I took it one evening. We backed it out of the pass. They had a big garage door where you could back the cars in and out. I backed it, started up, backed it out, and I stopped just before I got outside. Other thing that Mr. Gold failed to tell me, way back when I first started working on these cars, they had a tremendous vibration and a ringing. The body would go into a harmonic, and it would ring so bad at certain engine speeds and road speeds that a few times when I drove it, I would drive with earmuffs on because it was so bad. And this thing was worse. And the radio, the dash was vibrating so bad, I thought the radio was going to fall out. And he said, no, we still want to go for a ride. So we took for a little ride and come back, and he says, you know, Tom, we're not going to get any place. We've been chasing that around. You've been chasing around a long time before I started working on it. And we can't fix this. I said, we can't sell this car. He said, yeah, I know, but he says, I know we can solve it. I said, I understood that to mean somebody else is going to have to solve it because it wasn't going to happen that way. And we chased that around for another 6 months. We took the engine out of the car, brought it back to the engine plant. We balanced it. I was over also the engine balancing in the engine plant. We calibrated a balance stand to 0, 0, 0 as good as we could get it. We balanced that thing to 3 decimal places, put it back in the car. Didn't do anything. And Mr. Gold tried a lot of things. And at that time, I was racing on my own, and there's a fellow out in the East Coast named Eddie Quaid that built a lot of these cars for NHRA Superstock drag racing, where they cut the rear of the whole car out and they tub them and put the big roll cages in and everything. And I talked to him a number of occasions, and he said, he always called them flexible flyers. He says, you have to brace that car up. And we talked, I asked him about it, and he didn't know either, but finally he told me, he says, look, he says, where is the vibration coming from? I says, it comes right through the driver's seat, and it comes through the floorboard, right where you put your, that's the worst, and the rest of it's all over, but that's the worst place. He said, well then put the car up in a hoist and take a look at what's different under there. And I did. We had that in a V8 car. I'm looking, well, the big torque arm that goes from the rear end up to the transmission on the V8, it bolts into the transmission, and we did that with a extra bracket onto the back of the Buick transmission, and did it the same way. And I'm looking at that, and I thought, that's the only difference that we could see. And so I got Mr. Beitzel, he came out, and we had the fabricators make us a new cross member, and we moved that off and put it in a Heim joint, isolated it on a bracket away from the transmission. And so that fixed the problem. It was like magic. I mean, you start that thing, and it was smooth. It was almost all that, although for maybe commercial it had a little bit, because I drove so many of them, you could feel it. And I went back to the engine plant, and I took a piece of our flexible exhaust manifold tubing that we use for hooking up the production engines, made by Flexonics. And we cut that, and had one of Mr. Van Auken put it in there. And we put that next to a V8 car, and we got it close where you could put your hands on both the engine, and it was smoother. It was just like magic. And so Gold took the car, and I figured, well, you know, we got this pretty good. So I went back to work, and I got a call. It was about 2 weeks later, and Beitzel called me. He didn't call me very often. He says, why don't you come down to Malin Dragway? And he says, I want you to be there. He says, at a certain time, like 11 o'clock or something. And so I rode down there, and they had all these cars there, and some very high General Motors management. Mr. Lash was there, Mr. Gold was there, Byron Warner, but they had some higher level people, and Lloyd Royce was there, the president of General Motors, and they had a number of cars. They had Porsche, they had Mustangs, they had Camaros, they had Corvette, They had some Dodge stuff. I think what they have else, I don't know, a Renault Turbo, might have a Lotus, some other stuff. And they were running down the drag strip, and he says, they got this, and here's our, I call this the Gray Ghost. Because it was a pretty good car, and I did a lot of testing with it. I did a lot of the drag strip testing, because Mr. Weitzel and Tom Goad, they were road racers, and they did a lot of the brakes and the ride and handling stuff, but they liked me to do the drag racing because I was a drag racer. And I had run the fastest I'd run with this car in testing earlier, and the white car was a 1367, 102.9 miles an hour. And we knew that was way faster than a Corvette. In fact, we had a Corvette that was owned by Pass. And yeah, he was the accountant. There was a red Corvette, and it was really consistent. And every hour or two when we were testing, we'd run it down the track to see if anything changed. And that car would never, it would only vary 100 or two. It was 1440 to 1444 every run. And we could blister that thing. So we knew what was going on, and Weitzel and Goad got me aside and he says, this is on the ride, and this is for the next 2 or 3 years. And he says, they're going to decide in a day or two whether we're going to build this thing. And he said, I got this on the ride. And he said, now they'll go from here, they go do highway, and they go up in some hills, and then they went and do city traffic, and they had a meeting. And so I says, okay. So I was kind of taken back. I'd never been at that level of stuff before, and I just watched it all. And so I went back to work. And about a week later, Mr. Goad called me and says, hey, he says, we have a program. I says, what does that mean? He says, no, we have a real production program, and we're going to make these things. And I said, well, you better send something to our management in the engine plant, because they don't know exactly this is going on. So then they had to send a formal thing that, well, our engine plant's going to build these, and Buick Engineering's going to support it, and all that kind of stuff. And that's kind of how it went. And it became later that Pontiac management decided to make it a pace car in 1989, because this was in the fall of 1988. It was about, I don't know, July or August, that's right, took place. 87. And it took place, and it takes a while to get all this stuff in order and then make a program. But when they decided to make a car for the Indianapolis 500, there's very stringent performance criteria you have to meet. It's just not take a pretty fast car and go down there. You have to accelerate out of the pits and into the first turn, and by the time you get to the middle of first, between 1 and 2, you got to be going 120. You got brake tests, you have to do 120 to 0 in, I don't know, it's 134 feet or something. And then you got to go out the track, and you got to go simulate the start of the race. You got to go down the back straight at 70, accelerate up to 90, and then you got to punch it, and you got to come out into turn 3 and out of turn 4. You got to be going over 120, and then make the turn into the pits and slow it down. And they sent just the car, just like you guys drive, a street car. They drove it down there. And a fella, if I'm not mistaken, I don't know if Tom Goad went or Jim Lyons. Jim Lyons was also, he was the product manager of the Firebird, and he became associated with it after we got a program. So he goes down there, and he's talking to Indy 500 people. They had I believe it was Arlen Fingler, and they had another guy that was the head of the competition director. And then they have usually a couple race drivers, older race drivers, that do testing for them and stuff. So they're all talking. Mr. Lyons says, yeah, he says, well, finally they're talking. He says, where is your big truck with the real pace car? He says, that's the real pace car. And they kind of look at each other and say, oh, well, you know, and they're talking over here, and said, well, they haven't been here in a while. They don't really know.